Episode 1: What the Night Shift Does to a Person. I want to start with the room, not the patients, not the medication logs, not the particular quality of silence that settles over a hospice ward at 3 a.m. when the fluorescent lights have been dimmed to their lowest setting, and the only sound is the soft percussion of machines and the slower, less reliable percussion of breath. I want to start with the room, because the room is where everything happened, and because you need to understand a room before you can understand what a person does inside it. The room at Mercy Valley Hospice and Palliative Care was rooms, I should say. There were 14 of them on the night ward. 14 single-occupancy rooms arranged along 2 corridors that met at a nursing station shaped like a blunted V, and so that from where I sat, I could see partway down both hallways if I angled my chair correctly, which I always did. I had my chair positioned exactly right within my first week. That is the kind of person I am, or was. I notice angles. I notice what can be seen from where. I notice the distance between the nearest call button and the farthest bed. I notice these things the way a carpenter notices the grain of wood, automatically and without thinking about it. The way your hands know things your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Each room had a window. That was not a small thing. Whoever designed Mercy Valley had understood something important about dying, which is that the dying want to see outside even when they cannot go outside, that the sky is the last geography most people move through before they stop moving altogether. The windows faced east and west, alternating down the hallways, so in the course of a single night shift, you could watch both the end of one day and the beginning of the next, if you walked the hallways at the right intervals, which I always did. I am telling you about the room because I want you to understand that I loved it. I don't expect that to sit comfortably with you. I understand why it doesn't. But you asked me. No, you didn't ask me. That's not how this works, is it? I'm telling you because I want to be accurate. And accuracy requires me to say that I loved that ward the way some people love a church, the way some people love a garden, which is to say I loved it because it was the place where the most serious business of human life was conducted, and I was the one conducting it. I started at Mercy Valley in the autumn of 2003. I was 34 years old. I had been a general medical surgical nurse for 8 years at that point, and before that, I had been a nursing student, and before that, I had been a girl in Dorchester, Massachusetts, who understood from a very early age that the most reliable way to be useful to people was to know things they didn't know, and to stay calm when they couldn't. That was my value from the beginning, not my warmth. Other people have more warmth than I do, naturally, without trying. My value was the stillness. My value was the knowledge and the stillness together, which is rarer than either one alone. The hospice director who hired me was a man named Dr. Harlan Lees. Harlan was... I'll come back to Harlan. He requires his own space, his own chapter. For now, I'll tell you only that he shook my hand when I came in for my interview, looked at my resume for approximately 45 seconds, looked back at me and said, "You've worked the night shift the whole time, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. I told him yes, that was correct. I'd always preferred nights. And he nodded in a way that told me he understood something about me that I hadn't said out loud. Something about the particular psychology of the person who chooses, again and again, to be awake when everyone else is asleep, to be responsible when no one is watching. He hired me on the spot. We shook hands again. That is how it begins. I want to say something about what hospice care actually is, because you may have ideas about it that are not quite accurate. And I want you to understand what I was doing before I tell you what else I was doing. Hospice care is comfort care. It is the medical and emotional support provided to a person who has been determined by their physicians, often in consultation with the patient and their family, to have 6 months or less to live, and who has made the decision to stop pursuing curative treatment. The determination is not always accurate. People live longer than 6 months in hospice sometimes. They also sometimes die faster. The 6 months is a bureaucratic threshold, an insurance category, a rough estimate of a process that does not actually respect estimates. What hospice nurses do, what I did, is manage the end of the dying process to make it as comfortable as possible. We manage pain, we manage anxiety, we manage nausea, secretion buildup, the physical indignities of a body that is shutting down in a sequence that is, at its base, mechanical and without mercy of its own. We adjust medications, we hold hands, we answer questions at 2 in the morning when the family has gone home and the patient is alone and frightened. And the thing they want most in the world is for someone to tell them that what is happening is normal, that they are not broken, that the body knows what it's doing even when it feels like catastrophic failure. We are the ones who are there when the moment comes. Not always. Sometimes family is there. Sometimes a chaplain. But at 3 in the morning on the night shift, more often than anyone wants to acknowledge, it is the nurse. It is just the nurse and the patient and the room and the machines. And the nurse is the last authority in the building, and the nurse is the one who makes the calls. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further, because I have spent the last 9 months since the diagnosis, which is its own kind of symmetry, though I have resisted pointing it out to my oncologist, because she is not the kind of woman who appreciates that sort of thing. I have spent the last 9 months deciding how honest to be, what to say, and in what order, whether to start at the beginning, or start at the middle, or start at the end, which is where I am now, talking to you from a hospital bed that has been moved into my living room because I refuse to die in an institution, which is either ironic or fitting. And I've decided it's both. What I am going to tell you is the truth, but I want to be clear about what truth is in the context of what I did, which is this. The truth is not the same as guilt. The truth is not a confession in the legal sense. The truth is my account of what I understood myself to be doing and why, and what I believe now about whether I was right. Whether you agree with my conclusions is entirely your own business. I am not asking you to agree. I am not asking you to forgive me. I don't need either of those things now. What I need, what I have needed, actually, for longer than I have been dying, is to say it out loud, all of it, to someone who will listen without stopping me, without crying, without asking me if I'm sure. You won't stop me. That's why I'm talking to you. The first thing you need to understand about the night shift on a hospice ward is the particular texture of its silences. They are not all the same. A person who has not worked that shift would assume that silence is silence, that quiet is quiet. But you would be wrong about that, the way you are wrong about many simple things, before you have been forced to pay the kind of attention that emergency makes necessary. There is the silence of a room where someone is sleeping, genuinely sleeping, the body at its most honest, which is a warm silence, a silence with weight and breath in it, a silence that pushes back at you slightly when you stand in the doorway and listen. There is the silence of a room where someone is awake but has decided not to speak, lying in the dark, looking at the ceiling or at the window, waiting. That silence is thinner, cooler. It is a silence held by an act of will, and you can feel the will in it when you have learned what to feel for. And there is a third silence, the one that hospice nurses learn to recognize within their first weeks, if they have any sensitivity at all. The one that no one in my training ever named, because it does not have an official name, only a working name that we used among ourselves. We called it the leaving silence. It is the silence of a room where the body's departure has begun in earnest, where the deeper physiological processes have started their long withdrawal, and the person in the bed is no longer quite there in the way they were before, even if their eyes are sometimes open, even if they can still occasionally respond to their name. The leaving silence sounds like the other silences. That is the thing. You cannot tell it from the outside. You have to go in. You have to stand beside the bed and listen and look. And even then, even with 9 years of nights behind you and 147, I have counted them, I have always counted them, deaths witnessed from that particular proximity, even then it is not always entirely clear whether what you are hearing is sleep or waiting or leaving. I became, over those 9 years, very good at telling the difference. That skill, that particular calibration, is the beginning of everything I need to tell you. My first 6 months at Mercy Valley were orthodox. I want that on the record because it is true, and because it will matter later when you are trying to decide what kind of person I am, what category to put me in. For 6 months, I did exactly what my training and my role required me to do. I assessed patients. I administered medications within the parameters established by the attending physicians. I called physicians when parameters were exceeded, which happened often enough, because pain at the end of life is not a polite, manageable, within parameters kind of experience, but something that moves and changes and spikes and comes at you from new directions, just when you thought you had understood its geography. I called Harlan at night sometimes. He was always the first number. He answered, which not all of them did. He asked me the right questions, which was rarer. He trusted my assessment, which was rarer still, because nurses are trained to describe what they see, and doctors are trained to decide what to do about it. And the line between those two functions is very clear in theory and very blurry in the particular darkness of 3 a.m, when a man is screaming into his pillow and the ordered dose is not reaching him. I don't want you to think of Harlan as negligent. He was not negligent. He was humane, which is different. He understood that in palliative care, in the specific context of managing the final comfort of people who have already been given their prognosis, who are not going to improve, who have made the decision that they are done fighting. The calculus of medication is not the same calculus as in a general ward. You are not calculating against side effects in the long-term sense. There is no long-term sense anymore. You are calculating against suffering in the immediate, present, ongoing sense. And sometimes the medication that addresses suffering most effectively is the same medication that will, in sufficient doses or over time, hasten the end. This is not a secret. This is well-established medical ethics. There is even a name for it: the principle of double effect. The idea is this, that an action which produces both a good effect, the relief of suffering, and a bad effect, the hastening of death, is morally permissible provided that the intent is the good effect, and provided that the bad effect is not itself the means by which the good effect is achieved. The intent is the governing thing. The intent is everything. I understood this principle before I came to Mercy Valley. I understood it as a concept, a philosophical framework, the kind of thing you discuss in ethics seminars. It took those first 6 months to understand it as a practice, to understand what it feels like to stand at a bedside with a syringe in your hand and know, not suspect, know, that the dose you are drawing is both the right thing and the thing that will change the math of the night. The first time I understood it as a practice was in February of 2004. Her name was Margaret Osei. Episode 2. Margaret. Margaret Osei was 58 years old, which seemed very old to me then and seems very young to me now, which is the kind of irony that has become my primary companion in these last months. She had been a school teacher for 30 years, middle school mathematics, 6th and 7th grade. The children who are old enough to understand abstraction, but young enough that the understanding still feels like magic to them. She told me about this in our first real conversation, which happened about 10 days into her admission, when her pain was well enough managed for her to be interested in conversation again. She said, "Those children are at exactly the right age. They can see that 2 and 2 are 4, and they can also just barely begin to see why that is true, not just that it is true. And that distance between the fact and the reason for the fact, that's where the whole of mathematics lives. That's where I lived too," she said, in the distance. She was dying of pancreatic cancer. I don't need to describe what that looks like, except to tell you that it is one of the most painful ways a body can end. The pancreas is not a peripheral organ. It is not a limb, not something that can be isolated. It is central in every sense. Central to digestion, central to the body's chemistry, central in position, nestled among everything. And when it fails comprehensively, and with a comprehensiveness that spreads and radiates and does not respect the neat lines of any organ boundary. The pain is not in one place. The pain is in the concept of place itself. Margaret had a daughter named Adaize, who was 24 and worked for a non-profit that did something with housing advocacy, and who came every day in the early afternoon and sat with her mother for 2 hours before going back to whatever her life was when she was not watching her mother die. I don't say that to diminish Adaize's grief. Her grief was the real thing, the full body thing, the kind that came off her in waves you could feel from across the room. I'm saying it because it was true. Adaize had a life outside that room, a life that would continue. And Margaret knew this and was glad about it, and also, I think, in the way that dying parents are sometimes honest with themselves about things that they would never say, found it unbearable. We talked, Margaret and I, on the nights when she could. She was a woman of considerable intellectual organization, even under opioid management, even in significant pain. She asked good questions. She asked me once if I thought mathematics would survive us being human beings, if we were gone and something else arrived to look at the universe, whether the fundamental relationships between quantities that she had spent her life teaching would still be true. I said I thought they would, probably. She considered this and said that was either enormously comforting or enormously depressing. She couldn't quite decide which. She was not afraid of dying, she told me. She was afraid of the pain. And she was right to be afraid of the pain, because the pain was... I don't have words for it that won't feel like an understatement. I have clinical language. I have the Wong-Baker Faces scale, a 1 to 10, the language of assessment. Margaret's pain, on the worst nights, was not on that scale. It was off it, beyond it, somewhere that numbers don't reach, somewhere that her face went when it arrived, a place that was not quite her face anymore, just the architecture of it without the person inside. We were managing it. I want to say that clearly. We were managing it, the medical team, Harlan and the pain management consultant and I. We were adjusting and titrating and doing what we were supposed to do. The morphine doses were going up incrementally as they should, and they were taking the edge off. And the edge is often the best you can do, and the best is still a thing worth doing. But some nights the edge didn't hold. Some nights the pain moved faster than the protocol. And I would assess her and document and call Harlan. And Harlan would authorize an increase, and I would adjust, and we would get her back to manageable. And manageable is not comfortable, but it is different from what preceded it. One night in February, a Thursday, I believe, though the specific day of the week stops meaning much in hospice after a while. The pain moved faster than it had before. Margaret had been declining for 2 weeks, in the way patients with her diagnosis decline, which is in increments that feel like a long staircase you are descending. One step, then the landing, then another step, then a longer landing, and you begin to think you understand the pattern, and then you discover the staircase has no more landings, just steps, one after another. She was awake. That was the thing. She was awake and in severe pain, and she was not losing consciousness, which the body sometimes provides as a mercy in its own right, a kind of internal morphine that kicks in when the external inputs are insufficient. But that night, her body was not providing that. She was entirely present in her pain. I want you to understand what that means. Not the abstraction of it, but the specific, actual meaning. She was in the room, in her mind, behind her eyes, experiencing every second of what her body was doing to her, and there was no retreat available to her. I called Harlan. He authorized an increase. I drew the dose. I stood at her bedside. And I made a decision. The decision was, and I want to be as accurate as I can here, in my own account of my own psychology in that moment. The decision was not to give her more than the authorized dose. I want to be clear about that. I am not telling you that I overdosed Margaret Osei that night. What I did was give her the authorized dose, the full authorized dose, without what you might call the customary conservatism that nurses sometimes apply when titrating pain medication. The way you sometimes hold a small amount back, give it in 2 administrations rather than 1. Watch and wait. Be cautious. The caution is reasonable. The caution is protocol adjacent, if not protocol itself. The caution is, in practice, a kind of rationing that is applied in the interest of managing what happens next in an ordered way. That night, I did not apply the caution. I gave her the full dose, all of it, cleanly and quickly, and I stayed with her while it worked, which it did. Within minutes, her face moving from that terrible faraway place back towards something closer to herself, the lines around her eyes releasing, her breathing slowing, deepening. She looked at me. She didn't speak. I don't know what she saw when she looked at me. I hope she saw someone who was paying attention, someone who had understood what the night required. But she looked at me, and then she looked at the ceiling, and her face was, I can only call it, released. She died at 4:47 in the morning. Cause of death was documented as respiratory failure secondary to metastatic pancreatic carcinoma, which was accurate, which was entirely accurate. I documented my medication administration correctly. I noted the dose. I noted the time. I did not note that I had administered it all at once, rather than in the way I might have on a night when I was applying the customary caution, because there is no field on a medication administration record for the degree of caution applied. I want to say what I believe about what I did. I believe I was doing my job. I believe I was managing her pain in the way the situation required, in accordance with her physician's orders, in the service of her comfort, in the clear-eyed understanding that she was dying regardless, and that the question was not if, but when and in what state of being. I believe that what I did was defensible, that it was within the bounds of the principle of double effect, that my intent was her comfort, and her comfort alone. I believe all of this. I also know that I made a choice that night that I did not make on every night, and that the choice had consequences, and that the consequences were, in my estimation, the right consequences. And that is where it begins to get complicated. I did not feel guilt when Margaret died. I want to tell you that, because in most versions of this kind of story, The person telling it says there was guilt. There was always a kernel of guilt, even if I ignored it, even if I buried it. I am not going to tell you that, because it wouldn't be true. What I felt when Margaret Osei died was something much more difficult to name than guilt. It was a kind of certainty, a quiet, frightening certainty, the way you feel when you have solved a proof and the answer is both simpler and more disturbing than the problem suggested. The certainty was this: I had been paying attention, and the attention had mattered, and I had acted on what I knew in a way that was accurate. That is all it was. That is all I believed it was. And for a while, for longer than I should probably admit, I thought that was sufficient justification. Episode 3. The Philosophy of Thresholds. You should know that I am not, and have never been, a religious person. I don't say that to set myself up as the kind of character who dismisses religion. I find it genuinely interesting as a human phenomenon, as a way that people have organized their understanding of death, which is the organizing problem of the species. But I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't believe in a God who is tracking individual human actions and will hold them to account. I don't believe that what I did in those rooms at Mercy Valley will be weighed against me by any external authority. I believe I am the authority on my own actions. I realize how that sounds. I realize that it is exactly the thing that someone who has done something wrong would say: the grandiose self-justification, the inflation of individual judgment to divine status. I hear it as I say it, but I want you to sit with it a moment before you dismiss it, because I think there is something real in it that gets lost when it is used as an easy target. In medicine, specifically in nursing, specifically in the particular context of end-of-life care, individual judgment is not supplemental to the process. It is the process. It is what you are paying a nurse for when you pay a nurse. You are paying for someone who can be in the room, in the moment, with the specific patient, and make the calibration that the moment requires. The protocols are the floor. The physician's orders are the frame. But the judgment inside the frame is the nurse's, always. And if you have a good nurse, what you have is someone whose judgment can be trusted at 3 a.m. when no one else is watching. What I am telling you is that my judgment was good. That is not the same as saying it was right. I have spent a considerable amount of my dying time thinking about the difference between those two things. Goodness of judgment means accuracy, calibration, appropriate response to the information available. Rightness is a different question. It is the question of whether the values being applied to the judgment are themselves the right values, which is a philosophical problem of a different magnitude. I believed in relieving suffering. I believed in it with a conviction that was, in retrospect, more absolute than I recognized while I was operating inside it. I believed that suffering had no redemptive value. This put me at odds with some of the more spiritually oriented nurses on the ward, some of the chaplains, some of the patients themselves, who had theological frameworks that allowed them to find meaning in the suffering, to offer it, as they sometimes said, to receive something in return for it. I respected those frameworks. I genuinely did. I just didn't share them. I believed that suffering was suffering, that it was bad, that reducing it was good, and that these propositions required no external justification. Over the first 2 years at Mercy Valley, I developed, without quite knowing that I was developing it, a personal threshold system, a set of criteria, unwritten and internal, that governed when I applied the customary caution and when I did not. When I was conservative with the full authorized dose and when I was not. Let me be precise, because precision is required here. I am not telling you that I was administering medication outside of physician orders. In the overwhelming majority of cases, in all of them, technically, in the strict pharmacological sense, I administered medications within what had been authorized. In hospice, physician orders for pain management are typically written as ranges, precisely because pain management requires flexibility. Morphine 4 to 8 milligrams every 2 to 4 hours as needed for pain and dyspnea. That range is not decoration. That range exists because the physician has explicitly acknowledged that the appropriate dose cannot be determined in advance, that it must be assessed and applied by the nurse at the bedside, to that within those bounds, the nurse is making the call. My threshold system governed how I moved through those ranges, whether I started at the bottom and worked up, or assessed the situation as one that required the full end of the range from the beginning. Whether I gave the second PRN dose at the 2-hour mark when it was permitted, or waited for the 4-hour mark when the patient was stable. Small decisions, constant decisions. The kind of decisions that add up over 9 years, over 147 patients, in ways that are both measurable and unmeasurable. My threshold had several components. The first was the quality of the suffering. Not just the quantity, not just the number on the pain scale, though that mattered, but the quality. Whether the pain was acute and correctable, or whether it was in what I thought of as the final phase of intensification, where the body's disease processes had reached the point at which no amount of conservative pain management was going to change the fundamental trajectory, only slow its expression. At that threshold, conservative management felt to me not like prudence, but like a form of withheld relief, like knowing where the water is and choosing not to bring it. The second component was the patient's own relationship to what was happening. Their expressed wishes, yes, those were primary. If a patient told me they wanted more time, that they were frightened of sleep because they didn't know if they would wake, I listened to that, and I adjusted my approach accordingly. Their expressed wishes were not the only data, but they were the first data. I never acted against a patient's expressed wishes. I want that stated clearly. I never hastened anyone who was asking for more time. The third component, and this is the one that I have spent the most time examining in these 9 months of enforced examination, was what I can only call my assessment of the room. The room in the widest sense. The family situation, the social context, the quality of the dying that was happening. Whether the person in the bed had people who would grieve them fully, who would be there with them, who understood what was coming and were prepared for it. Or whether the room had that other quality, the one I noticed sometimes and tried not to think too much about, the quality of a situation in which the dying was extending beyond the point where anyone, including the person dying, had the resources for it. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that the third component is where a reasonable person begins to feel very uncomfortable, because it is where individual judgment has moved some distance from the purely clinical and into a territory that has other names, other histories, other implications. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I'm going to tell you is that I was not thinking about those other names, those other histories. I was thinking about the room. I was always only thinking about the room. There was a man named Robert Cahill. I need to tell you about Robert Cahill because he is the one I go back to most often in the dark. In the particular dark of 4 in the morning when the oxygen concentrator hums and the pain medication is doing what it is supposed to do. But my mind has its own agenda and pursues it regardless. Robert Cahill is the one I go back to because he is the one I am least certain about. I want to tell you about him accurately. I want to not make him a villain, because he was not a villain. He was a man. He was 71 years old, and he had a form of heart failure that had been advancing for 3 years. and that had reached the point at which his physicians had determined that further intervention was not going to meaningfully extend his life in any quality-adjusted sense. He was a retired civil engineer. He had been married for 44 years to a woman named Patricia, and Patricia had died of a stroke 2 years before his hospice admission, and he had not, by any account including his own, fully come back from that loss. He talked about Patricia constantly. Every night I worked his corridor, and I worked it more nights than chance alone would explain. I will be honest about that. I arranged my assignments when I could, which isn't always possible but is sometimes possible. And with Robert, I found ways to be on his corridor. Every night he wanted to talk about Patricia, and I let him, and sometimes I started him. Asked him a question that I knew would open the story, because I had learned that talking about her was itself a kind of medicine for him, the only kind that was working. She had been a librarian. He had loved her with the specific devotion of a practical man who has found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the great organizing principle of his life is another person. He was not good at abstract emotional language. He was an engineer. He talked about things in terms of their properties, their load-bearing capacities, their resistance to various stresses. But when he talked about Patricia, he found a fluency that he clearly hadn't known was in him until it came out. He said once, in the 3rd week of his admission, that he had not understood until she died that he had been using her to hold the world in the right position, and that without her, the world had tilted by some small, permanent number of degrees, just enough to make everything slightly wrong, slightly off-kilter. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that he could feel it in everything, constantly, a low-grade wrongness that he could not correct. He was not a man who wanted to be alive. I want to be very careful about how I say that. He did not say it directly. He was too much of a particular generation for that direct statement, and too formed by a set of ideas about what men admitted. But he said it around the edges. He said he was tired, frequently, and I understood from the way he said it that he meant tired of a kind that sleep does not fix. He said he didn't understand what the point of the days was anymore. He said he thought Patricia was somewhere. He didn't know where exactly. Somewhere that wasn't here, and that here had become harder and harder to recommend. He had a son, Frank. Frank Cahill was 42 and managed a property business in Providence, and Frank came on weekends, not every weekend, but most weekends. And he sat with his father in the way that some children sit with a dying parent, which is the way you sit with something you are waiting to be over. Not because you are a bad person, necessarily, but because the waiting has gone on long enough that the grief has started ahead of schedule, has already arrived, and you are now living in a strange, doubled state in which you are both still present and already elsewhere. I noticed Frank on his 2nd visit. The way he noticed the room, the way his eyes moved when he thought no one was watching him, to the window, to the door, to his watch, to his phone, which he checked in the way people check phones when they are looking for permission to be somewhere else. He was not cruel to his father. He was attentive in the ways he knew how to be attentive. He brought things, food that Robert couldn't really eat, a book that he thought his father might like, but that Robert set aside without opening. He asked the right questions in the right voice. He held his father's hand. He did the things. But there was something in the room when Frank was there. I felt it the way I felt all the room's invisible properties, the angle of information, the quality of the air. It was not malice. It was relief. Frank Cahill had organized himself around the expectation of this ending, and the ending was taking longer than he had organized himself for, and the prolongation was costing him something he had not budgeted for. I don't know what Robert's estate was worth. I did not know then. I don't know now. I am telling you what I observed, not what I concluded from it. Robert Cahill died on a Wednesday night in April of 2006, when I was the nurse on duty, and his pain was documented as severe, and I administered a dose of morphine at the full upper end of his authorized range. His respiratory function declined over the following hour, and his heart stopped at 2:23 in the morning, and I was with him when it did. He was not distressed at the end. He was very quiet. He said Patricia's name, once, quietly. Not in the way you call out to someone, but in the way you say a word you have been saving for a specific moment. I documented correctly. I noted the time and the dose. I called the on-call physician, and I called Frank, who answered on the second ring and said thank you before I had finished telling him what had happened, which is either grief or something else. I have never been able to decide which. Episode 4. What Sister Annette Knew. There was a nurse on the day shift, and then eventually the evening shift, and then eventually, for about a year, the night shift, which brought her into my direct orbit, named Annette Mbeki, who went by Sister Annette because she had been a novice in a religious order for several years in her early 20s, before deciding that her vocation was nursing rather than vows, which she said were not as different as people assumed, both being forms of promised attendance to other people's suffering. Annette was from Cameroon originally, had trained in France, had come to the United States for reasons she described as complicated and declined to elaborate on, which I respected because I also had things I declined to elaborate on. She was 47 when we overlapped on nights. She was a broad, as composed woman with a stillness in her that was different from my stillness. Hers came from a place of peace, or what looked like peace, what had the properties of peace, a settled relationship with the fact that human beings suffer and die, and that being present for that is not a burden, but a form of honor. Mine came from somewhere else. I knew the difference, even then. She was very good at her job. We had an easy professional relationship for the first several months of sharing the night shift, the kind that forms between competent people working in close quarters, built on efficiency, on covering for each other at the right moments, on the shorthand that develops when two people have memorized the same 14 rooms and know all the same patients by their medical histories, and also by their faces, and also by the particular sound of their breathing on the worst nights. It was in the second year of our shared shift that I began to notice Annette noticing me. Not overtly. Annette was not a woman who did things overtly. She was precise, and she was quiet, and she observed. And what I noticed was that she was observing me specifically, with the focused attention of someone who has filed something away and is checking it against ongoing information. The observations were small, each individually negligible. The way she would sometimes appear in a doorway when I was in a patient's room, not entering, just present for a moment before moving on. The way she reviewed the medication administration records for patients on my corridor in the morning handover, which was entirely her prerogative, entirely normal, except that she reviewed mine with slightly more care than was required by routine. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Noticing was my primary skill. I did not change my behavior. This is the thing I have thought about most in these months of thinking, that I did not change my behavior when I realized Annette was watching. I considered it. I considered being more conservative, demonstrating conservatism explicitly, giving her less to observe. I decided against it. Partly because I believed what I was doing was appropriate and felt no need to disguise it. Partly because changing my behavior under observation would itself be a form of acknowledgement, a concession that there was something to be observed, and I was not prepared to make that concession. And partly, I will be honest, because I believed that Annette, if she was truly paying attention, would reach the same conclusions I had reached, that she would see what I saw in the rooms, that she would understand. We had one direct conversation about it. One. It was in the break room in the early morning, about 4 years into our shared shift, February or March. The particular flat light of institutional buildings before dawn, when the windows are still dark and the fluorescents are the only truth. We were both drinking coffee. We were both at the end of a long night. She was looking at her cup when she said it, and she didn't look up when she said it, which is the way certain conversations begin when the person saying the thing has decided they need to say it, but hasn't decided what happens after. She said, "I've been thinking about Mr. Cahill." I said, "He died well. He was ready." She said, "He was ready. I know." And then she was quiet for a moment, still looking at her cup, and she said, "I wonder sometimes about the timing." I said, "The timing was good. He was in pain. He was suffering. He had his wife on his mind, and he was tired, and his pain was real and severe and documented." She said, "Yes, all of that is true." And she looked up at me then, and what was in her face was not accusation. It was something more complicated than accusation, something sadder, something that had the quality of a person who has done the math and arrived at an answer they weren't hoping for. She said, "I think you care very much about your patients." I said, "I do." She said, "I think that's the truest thing about you. And I think it's also the most dangerous thing about you." I waited. She said, "I'm not going to report anything. There's nothing to report. Everything in the records is correct and complete, and I know that." I said, "It is." She said, "I know. That's the thing. Everything is correct and complete, and still there's something." I said, "There's always something. That's hospice." She looked at me for a long moment. Not hostility, not accusation. Something closer to grief, I think. A kind of grief for a specific thing she wasn't going to name. Then she stood up and rinsed her cup and went back to the ward. She transferred to the evening shift 8 months later. She told the director it was a family scheduling issue. I never asked her if that was true. I did not want her to have to answer a question I already knew the answer to. I want to tell you about the ones who were simply good deaths, because there were many of them. The majority, actually. And I don't want you to think that what I am confessing is something that happened with frequency or carelessness. I want you to understand the texture of the work, the full texture, so that what I am telling you doesn't float free of its context and become a simpler thing than it is. Mrs. Dolores Ferrante, 83, end-stage COPD, died with her 4 daughters in the room, all of them holding a different part of her hands and her arms and the side of her face. I was in the doorway, then not in the doorway. They didn't need me for that one. Dolores had made her choices. She had declined ventilation, had been clear about what she wanted, and what she wanted was her girls, and she had them. I passed that doorway 4 times during the last hour of her life, and every time I looked in, I saw the same thing. 4 women grieving in real time, present to it, not managing it or deferring it, but simply being inside the grief while the person they were grieving was still alive to receive it, which is a kind of love that I have not seen demonstrated in many contexts, but which I have seen frequently in hospice rooms, and which I believe is among the most serious and difficult things a human being can do. I administered nothing unusual to Dolores Ferrante. She died at the right moment, in the right way, with the right people in the room, and my job that night was to be invisible, and I was invisible. And that is also a skill. the skill of knowing when not to be the thing that is happening. A man named Gerald Okafor, 61, liver cancer. A retired jazz drummer who kept time on his blanket with 2 fingers, even in the last week of his life, tapping some internal rhythm that persisted past the point where much else did. His wife Ngozi and I talked in the corridor while he slept, sometimes for an hour at a stretch. The conversations that happen in hospice corridors that have no parallel in any other setting. Honest, specific, often very funny, because the proximity to death seems to return people to the urgency of being real, of saying what they actually think and feel, rather than what they are supposed to say. Ngozi told me once that she and Gerald had spent most of their marriage being polite to each other in ways that were, in retrospect, a form of cowardice, and that being here, being with him through this, had finally made them both brave enough to be unkind to each other, in the way that only people who love each other can be unkind. That they'd had more real fights and more real reconciliations in the 4 weeks of his hospice stay than in the previous decade of their marriage. She said, "I think he's going to die, and I'm going to miss him more than I missed him when we were wasting each other's time." Gerald Okafor died without my intervention. He died tapping his 2 fingers on the blanket, and the tapping stopped, and then everything else stopped. And his timing at the very end was, like any good drummer's timing, impeccable. Those deaths mattered as much to me as the others. They mattered differently, but they mattered as much. They were the proof that I was doing what I thought I was doing, that I was paying attention, that the attention was calibrated, that I was not applying a single uniform approach to everyone who came through those 14 rooms, but rather a specific response to the specific situation, each time, every time. That is what I believed about myself. That is mostly what I was. Episode 5. The Night I Cannot Straighten Out. I need to tell you about Dennis Marsh. I have been building toward Dennis Marsh since I began talking, taking the long way around in the way that minds go. The long way when they are approaching something they know will be difficult to look at directly. You probably knew, even if you didn't consciously identify it, that there was someone I was approaching obliquely, that the story I was telling had a destination I was circling. Because that is the shape of a true confession. It spirals in on itself. It can't help it. The gravity of the real thing pulls everything toward it eventually. Dennis Marsh was 54 years old. He had ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the disease that destroys the motor neurons with a methodical, unhurrying completeness. That takes from a person first the peripheral movements, the fine motor control, the hands, the feet, and works its way inward, toward the core, toward the breathing, toward the last involuntary functions, so that what remains at the end is, in some cases, a fully conscious mind inside a body that has stopped being able to do anything except continue to be alive, which is a condition that has no good description in ordinary language, but which in clinical language is sometimes called locked-in syndrome, and in literary language might be called being trapped at the bottom of yourself. Dennis had been diagnosed 3 years before his hospice admission. He was, at the time of his admission, in the advanced stage. He had lost most voluntary movement. He was on a ventilator. He communicated via a specialized device that tracked minimal eye movement and converted it to text and then to synthesized speech, a process that was slow and laborious, and that he used, in my experience of him, very deliberately, saving it for things worth saying. He was, by the account of everyone who knew him, and by all the evidence of the time I spent in his room, a man of considerable intelligence and strong opinions. He had been a professor of philosophy at a university in Vermont. The specific name is not mine to give. And he had spent his academic career working in the area of personal identity. the question of what constitutes the continuity of a self over time. What makes you the same person at 50 that you were at 5? Whether the person at the end of a degenerative neurological disease is in any meaningful sense the same person who received the diagnosis 3 years earlier. You can see the particular cruelty that his disease offered him. He had spent his career thinking about these questions, and now he was living inside the most extreme version of them, watching his own body become a philosophical problem that he could not resolve. I read some of his papers. I don't say that to impress you. I say it because it's true, and because it's part of what happened, and because I think it matters that I went looking for him, that I wanted to understand who he was before he was what the disease had made him. He had a wife, Catherine. Catherine Marsh was 51, a high school English teacher, a woman who had organized her entire existence, her schedule, her emotional reserves, her relationship to hope and despair, around the management of Dennis's illness for 3 years, and who had arrived at his hospice admission in a state that I can only describe as depleted in a way that had become structural. Not temporary exhaustion, not grief that would ease with rest, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has given everything for so long that the concept of having something to give no longer quite applies. She was present. She loved him. I do not question any of that, but she was also, visibly and undeniably, a person at the end of her own resources. They had no children. Dennis communicated with me. He wanted to communicate, which was not true of all patients, and I respected it and responded to it, and spent more time in his room than was strictly required, more time than I spent in other rooms, because his questions interested me, and because he was, there is no other way to say it, a person whose company I found valuable, even at the end of things, even in the specific form that his company now took. He asked me things about my work, about what I believed, about how I had come to do what I did. He asked me once, through the eye tracking device, with the particular directness that people develop when every word is a significant effort, "Do you believe that how a person dies matters?" I said, "Yes." He tracked his eyes for a long time, and the synthesized voice said, "More than how they live?" I thought about it. I said, "As much, not more." He typed again. "Then pay attention to how I am dying." I said, "I am." He typed, "I know you are. That's why I'm talking to you." Dennis Marsh expressed his wishes to me on 3 separate occasions during his admission. He expressed them through his device, carefully and slowly, and I listened to each one with the attention they deserved, and I documented what was appropriate to document, and I held the rest in myself, the way you hold things that don't belong in documents. He told me he was tired. He told me that the self that was being maintained inside the machine, his word, machine, the phrase he used for his own body at this stage, not with bitterness, but with the philosophical precision of someone naming a thing accurately, was not a self he recognized as continuous with the self he had been, not because of memory loss, not because of cognitive impairment, both of which he had escaped, but because the body and the self are not separable in the way his early career had theorized, that the argument he had made in print for 20 years, that what constitutes a person is their psychological continuity, their memories and intentions and character, had turned out to be wrong in a specific, bodily, undeniable way, that you cannot be yourself without a body that is capable of expressing what you are, and that his body had become incapable of that expression in any of the ways that had ever mattered to him. He told me he was not afraid of death. He told me he was afraid of the continuation of this. He could not formally request assisted dying. We were not in a state where that was legal, and he was not in the physiological condition where palliative sedation, the practice of sedating a patient into unconsciousness to relieve refractory suffering, had been officially determined to be indicated because palliative sedation is governed by its own set of protocols and criteria, and Dennis's suffering, while real and severe and documented by his own testimony via the device, was not primarily physical in the way those criteria were designed to measure. His pain management was straightforward by the standards of what I usually dealt with. ALS does not typically produce the same levels of acute pain as cancer or organ failure. What it produces is a different kind of suffering, the suffering of profound limitation, of being alive in a body that has stopped being able to serve the life inside it. I administered his medications correctly. I managed his ventilator care. I monitored his comfort as I was trained to do. One night, I will not tell you the date, I will not give you that specificity, because there is a version of specificity that becomes evidence, and I am not interested in providing evidence, only truth. One night, in the 3rd month of his admission, I was doing my regular check, and I stood in Dennis Marsh's room, and I looked at him in the leaving silence, and I made a calculation. I made a calculation about his medications, about the specific combination of agents he was receiving, and the doses and the timing and the interaction between them, and the management of his ventilator function, and what adjustments, small adjustments, adjustments within range, adjustments that would read cleanly in the documentation, might be made. I made the calculation, and I stood there for a long time, and I did not make the adjustments. I did not do it. I stood there and I did not do it, and I left the room, and I went and sat at the nursing station, and I sat there for 15 minutes, and I did not document what I had been thinking, because there is no field for that. And then I went back and checked on the other rooms. Dennis Marsh died 41 days later, on the day shift, when I was not there. I found out when I came in that evening and looked at the board, and his room was gone from it. The room had already been cleaned and reassigned to a new patient, a woman with ovarian cancer, which is how hospice works. It cannot afford the luxury of leaving rooms empty as memorials. Rooms are rooms. They serve the living until the living are dead, and then they serve the next living. I want to tell you what the 41 days were for me. I want to be accurate about this because I think it is the most important piece of self-knowledge I can offer you. I thought about him every night I worked those 41 days. I thought about what I had decided not to do. I thought about the calculation I had made and then stepped back from. And what I felt, this is the part that requires the most honesty, the most care. What I felt was not relief. What I felt was not the clean, certain feeling I had felt after Margaret, or after several others, the feeling of having done the thing the moment required. What I felt was uncertainty, and uncertainty had not visited me in that way before, not in that form, not about a specific patient, a specific room, a specific moment of standing in the dark and doing the math. I think I have thought about this for months now, and this is what I have arrived at. I think the uncertainty was not about Dennis. I think the uncertainty was about me. I think that in Dennis Marsh's room, I encountered for the first time the possibility that my judgment and my motivation were not as transparent to me as I believed. That there might be things driving the calculation that were not pure, not simply about suffering and relief, and the accurate reading of a room. I had been telling myself, for years by then, that my threshold system was about the patient, about their pain, their exhaustion, their expressed wishes, their quality of life, their own relationship to their dying. And it was about those things. I believe it was about those things. But standing in Dennis Marsh's room, I noticed something about the calculation I was making. I noticed that it was not only about Dennis, it was about Catherine. It was about the woman in the waiting room, the woman at the end of her resources, the woman who had given everything for 3 years and had arrived at the bottom of herself, who came every day and sat with him and held his hand and talked to him and read to him, and whose face, when she thought no one was watching, was a face that had moved past grief into something more permanent, some geological stratum below grief, where the minerals are different. I was doing the calculation for Dennis, and I was also, without fully acknowledging it, doing the calculation for Catherine. And that is the difference. That is the difference between the thing I believed I was doing and the thing I was sometimes doing. The difference is not large. I have spent months measuring it, and it is not large. It does not overturn everything. Margaret Osei was still Margaret Osei. The others I am certain about are still the ones I am certain about. But Dennis Marsh showed me the seam in my own reasoning, the place where what I called judgment had started to include variables I hadn't formally acknowledged, and the acknowledgement, or the near acknowledgement, the standing in the room with it, was what stopped my hand that night. I did not stop going into rooms. I did not change my practice in any significant way after Dennis Marsh. I continued at Mercy Valley for 3 more years. I continued to pay attention and to make the calibrations the nights required. I continued to believe, in the large and general sense, that what I was doing was appropriate, that my judgment was sound, that the patients in my care were dying better for my attention. But I carried Dennis Marsh with me. He is in the room with me now, actually, tonight, here in my living room with the oxygen concentrator and the modified bed and the window that faces east. He and Margaret and several others. Not as guilt. I keep coming back to that word, and I keep declining it, because it is not quite the right word, and I refuse to reach for an easy word when the accurate one is more complicated. They are here as questions. Episode 6. The Body That Knows. Let me tell you about my mother. I have been avoiding this part in the way I have avoided few other parts, which should tell you something about what this part is. I am not a person who avoids things easily. I find avoidance intellectually lazy, emotionally cowardly, and practically ineffective. And yet here we are, 40-some minutes into this account, and I haven't mentioned her yet, which means she is the gravity around which everything else has been orbiting. My mother's name was Ellen Novak, before she married my father and became Ellen Callahan, and then Ellen Novak again after she divorced him when I was 11, because she was a woman who knew where she came from and preferred her own name. She was a woman of considerable force. I don't mean loud. I mean forceful, in the specific sense of a person whose presence reorganizes the room around them, who doesn't take up more space than they need, but whose need is definite and uncompromising. She had a stroke when she was 69, a significant one. Hemorrhagic, not ischemic, the worse of the two kinds. The kind where the blood is in the brain instead of kept from it, where the damage is from pressure and drowning rather than deprivation. She survived it. But surviving and recovering are different projects. And she recovered partially, incompletely, in ways that she found intolerable, and that she did not hesitate to tell me she found intolerable, because she was a woman who had always been direct, and the stroke had not taken that from her, had in some ways intensified it. The way damage sometimes burns away the peripheral and leaves the essential. She could walk with assistance. She could speak with some difficulty, with the particular word-finding hesitations of a person whose language pathways have been rerouted around damaged tissue and find themselves taking longer to arrive. She could not live independently. She moved in with me for 8 months, and those 8 months were the most honest, most difficult, most clarifying 8 months of my adult life. Because living with your mother when you are 46 and she is 70, and you are both women of strong will, and neither of you has ever been particularly good at being cared for, is a kind of concentrated education in all the things you do not know about yourself. She told me in those 8 months several things she had not told me before. Some of them were things I needed to know, and some of them were things I could have gone my whole life without and would have preferred to. She told me she knew about me. Not about Mercy Valley specifically, not about any specific decision, but about the shape of my relationship to control, to judgment, to the authority that resides in the person who knows the most and stays the most calm. She said, "I raised you to know things. I didn't think through what a person does when they know more than they're supposed to know." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I mean that you have always decided things for people who didn't know they were letting you decide. When you were 8 years old, you decided I should leave your father, and you engineered the situation until I left. You didn't lie. You just arranged information in the way that would produce the outcome you believed was correct. You've been doing that your whole life." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She looked at me with the look that came from 69 years of looking at the world and 20 of looking specifically at me, and she said, "Yes, you do. I want to be honest about what happened when my mother's second stroke came. She had been declining for 6 months. Her condition had been moving in the direction that the neurologists had predicted from the beginning, a pattern of incremental loss, small but cumulative, each week a little less of the peripheral capacities that she found most binding to her sense of herself. The ability to read without the words sliding, the ability to walk without two-point assistance, the ability to exist in a conversation as the most capable person present rather than the one being managed. The managing was what she could not stand. She had spent 70 years being the one who managed, and she was now, through no choice of her own, on the other side of it. And this had not moved her to equanimity. It had moved her to a fury that was the more devastating for being so quiet, so controlled, so specifically channeled into the daily negotiations of care. She told me, this was 6 weeks before the second stroke, that she wanted to die at home. She did not mean this as a casual preference. She meant it with the precision she had always applied to the things that mattered most. She wanted to die in her house, in the house where she had lived for 30 years. Not in my apartment where she was a guest. In her house. In her bedroom, in her own bed, looking at her own ceiling, with whatever was left of her own life organized around her in the way she had organized it. We arranged this. She was moved to her house. Hospice was arranged. A different hospice than Mercy Valley, a hospice in her county, though I spoke with her nurses in the way that nurses speak to each other when one of them is the family member, which is a very particular conversation, layered with professional courtesy and personal need, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the professional in the family is always also a frightened person who would give anything to not know what they know. I visited every day that I was not working. I drove 40 minutes each way, and I sat with her and I talked to her, and sometimes I helped with her care, informally, the way that family members with clinical backgrounds sometimes do, the kind of help that is welcomed and that also complicates the clean boundaries between roles in ways that everyone involved chooses not to examine too closely. The night of the second stroke, I was not there. I was at work. My phone rang at 2:17 in the morning, which is the exact time I still know without checking, because it is the time that is filed in me somewhere, the time that has a weight and a position in my memory that other times do not have. I drove to her house. By the time I arrived, she was unconscious, which is the word we use, though what I mean is that she was in the leaving silence, the one I knew better than any other. The third silence. The one that does not sound different from the outside, but that has a different quality entirely when you go in and stand beside the bed and listen. I sat with her for 2 hours. Her nurse, a young woman named Priya, maybe 28, careful and kind, visibly uncertain what to do with the experienced hospice nurse in the family who had arrived at 2:30 in the morning and was sitting very still in the corner, asked me several times if I needed anything, and I told her no, and eventually she left us, and I sat there in the silence with my mother. I did not do anything. I want to be clear about that. I was not in any professional capacity that night. I had no medications, no equipment, no role, except the only role I had never been comfortable in, which was the role of the person for whom nothing can be done, because the thing being done is being done by someone else, by the body's own systems, by the disease and the time. My mother died at 5:04 in the morning. Priya came back and confirmed what I had already known for 20 minutes. I called my half-brother in Connecticut, who arrived 4 hours later, and we did what families do, which is move through the specific tasks that follow a death in the way that moving through tasks is the only available response to the impossibility of the thing that has just happened. I have thought about that night more than any other single night in my adult life. I have thought about what it meant that I did nothing. Whether it meant that I was, in that context, simply a daughter, is simply a person without the authority or the equipment or the role. Whether it means that what I did in other rooms was not what I feared it sometimes was, because when I was only a person and not a nurse, only family and not the authority, I did nothing. Or whether it means the opposite. Whether it means that what I did in other rooms was not about the patients at all, was always and entirely about my own need to be the one who knew the most and acted accordingly, and that when that role was not available to me, I defaulted to inaction, to simply being there, to the thing I had never quite trusted myself to be. I cannot tell you which interpretation is correct. I have been dying for 9 months, and I cannot tell you. Episode 7. What the records say and do not say. There was an inquiry. I should tell you that. It was not the kind of inquiry you might be imagining. No criminal investigation, no professional licensing board action, no public record that you could find by searching my name, because nothing was ever formally pursued, nothing was ever officially concluded, and I have spent considerable time in these months deciding whether that is a vindication or an indictment of the system that was supposed to catch things like what I may have been doing. It began in 2009, my 7th year at Mercy Valley, when a risk management review was conducted of the ward's mortality patterns as part of a broader accreditation process. This is a routine thing. Accreditation bodies look at outcomes, at mortality rates, at medication administration patterns, because these are the kinds of statistical surfaces that can sometimes reveal anomalies that individual case review does not catch. The review was conducted by an outside firm, which is standard, and they produced a report, which I never saw, but which I know something about, because Harlan told me things in the way that Harlan told me things, which is carefully, with the specific carefulness of a man who trusts someone and is simultaneously frightened of what the trust might be protecting. He called me into his office. This was October of 2009. He was 63 at that point, white-haired, still wearing the same style of reading glasses he'd worn when he hired me, still with the careful way of asking questions that made you feel the question was a kind of gift, to an invitation to say the thing that mattered rather than the thing that was safe. He said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." I said, "I always answer you honestly." He said, "I know you do. That's not the same as saying this will be easy." He told me about the review. He told me that the patterns the outside firm had flagged were statistical, that the specific nights and specific medication administrations that they had identified were all individually within range, all correctly documented, all consistent with authorized orders. He told me that the firm had concluded there was no evidence of impropriety, that their report would reflect this conclusion, that the accreditation process would proceed normally. Then he stopped talking for a long moment. He looked at his desk. He said, "I trust you." I said, "I know." He said, "I've trusted you for 7 years. 7 years of nights where you've been the authority in that building, and I've known the patients were in capable hands." I said, "They have been." He looked up at me. He said, "Have they been in the right hands?" "That's a different question." I said, "I believe they have." He held my eyes for a long time. Harlan had the particular eyes of someone who has spent decades in medicine, which is to say they were not innocent. They had seen too much, held too much, been the last thing too many people looked at as they were trying to understand what was happening to them. They were compassionate eyes, and they were tired eyes, and they were, in that moment in his office, frightened eyes. He said, "I'm going to take your word for it. I want you to know that I understand the weight of what I'm accepting by doing that." I said, "I understand it too." He said, "I hope so." He never asked me again. We worked together for 2 more years before I left Mercy Valley. I left voluntarily in 2012 for reasons that were officially described as a career transition and that were, in their actual substance, a decision I made about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like, and whether staying at Mercy Valley was consistent with what I had started to understand about myself in the years after Dennis Marsh. Harlan retired the same year. He sent me a card when he heard about the diagnosis, a real card, handwritten, and what he wrote was not what most people write, which is something about strength or fighting or the certainty that I would handle this the way I handled everything, with competence and composure. What Harlan wrote was this: "I have thought about you more than you know. I hope the thinking has been toward understanding rather than toward certainty, because the most dangerous thing I ever saw in you was your certainty, and the best thing I ever saw in you was what came just after it." I don't know exactly what he meant. I think I know. I think he was referring to the moments, and they existed. They were not rare. When I stood in a room, and the certainty told me to act, and something else, something adjacent to doubt, told me to be still, to stay, to just be present. And I listened to the thing that was not the certainty. I am not sure if those moments of stillness are what justify the moments of action, or whether they are simply other moments entirely, each one standing alone. I think about Adaise Osei sometimes, Margaret's daughter. She will be in her mid-40s now, doing whatever her life has produced, living in whatever city, with whatever people around her. She doesn't know who I am. She doesn't know that a night shift nurse with a particular philosophy of thresholds was working on her mother's corridor in February of 2004. She knows her mother died. She knows the cause of death. She knows the timing, which in retrospect is probably what most children of people who die in hospice know, a sense of the shape of the dying, a sense that it was or was not too fast, a sense that the people in the building were or were not paying attention. I hope she feels they were paying attention. I believe they were. Episode 8. The Pharmacology of Staying. I should tell you what is happening to me now. Not the medical details, or not only those, but the experiential truth of it, the way it actually is to be on the other side of the thing I spent 9 years administering. I have ovarian cancer. This is, in the taxonomy of dying, a familiar destination for women of my age, women who had no children, women whose hormonal history followed a particular pattern. It is also, in the taxonomy of suffering, one of the more comprehensive options. The abdominal cavity is not a small territory, and cancer that has spread within it is not a local problem. My oncologist, who is a precise woman named Dr. Veena Sharma, with a gift for understatement that I respect enormously, described my situation at the time of diagnosis as advanced, which in oncological language means approximately what leaving means in hospice language. The process has reached a stage where the primary work is no longer reversal. I did several rounds of chemotherapy. I want to say that without apology or explanation, because I am aware of the irony. A hospice nurse, a person who has sat at the bedsides of dying people and made decisions about their comfort and their endings, choosing to pursue aggressive curative treatment when her turn came. I have had to sit with that irony. I have had to be honest with myself about what it means. What it means, as near as I can tell, is that I was not as decided as I thought. That somewhere in the 9 years of certainty, there was a version of me that was not certain, a version that wanted more time, that was not ready. That did not approach her own dying with the equanimity she had administered to others. That this version of me reached for the chemotherapy not because she thought it would work. The prognosis was never optimistic, but because she needed to try. Because the trying was its own kind of information. The chemotherapy did not work in any meaningful long-term sense. I have been moved to palliative care now, which is managed by a team I have had the very strange experience of evaluating with a professional's eye while being its patient. They are good. They are doing the right things in the right order. My pain is managed, not eliminated, managed. And the difference between those two things is something I understand more intimately now than I did before, which is saying something. My nurse is a man named David. He is 31, dark-haired, very calm, and he has the particular quality that I recognized in myself when I was starting out, and that I have spent years trying to articulate. He is present in a way that is not performance, not the professional affect of warmth, but something more specific and demanding, the actual attention of someone who is seeing you, who is noting the real information and responding to it, who knows the difference between what you say and what you mean. He came last week at the end of his shift, and he sat in the chair by the window and he said, "Is there anything you want to talk about?" I thought about this for a moment. I thought about all the things I could say to him, all the specific and particular things I have been saying to you, and I thought about what it would mean to say any of them to a person in this position, a person who is responsible for my care, who is young, and who has his whole professional life ahead of him. I said, "Are you a good nurse?" He was surprised by the question. He said, "I think so. I try to be." I said, "What does that mean to you? Being good at this?" He thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. He said, "I think it means paying attention, seeing what's actually happening, not just what the chart says. Responding to the person, not the diagnosis." I said, "And when what the person needs and what the chart says are different things?" He held my gaze. He was not afraid of the question, which told me something. He said, "That's the hardest part of the job." I said, "Yes, it is." I did not tell him anything else. I let the conversation find its natural end, which it did, quietly, and he left, and I have thought about what he said. That's the hardest part of the job. In the days since, turning it over, not as a vindication or a condemnation, but as a recognition. Someone young and careful had put his finger on the same thing I had been circling for 20 years. That the hardest part is not the technical skills, not the pharmacology, not the documentation, Not even the witnessing of suffering, though that is hard. The hardest part is the distance between what is visible and what is true, and what you do in that distance, alone, in the dark, at 3 a.m, when no one is watching except the machines. I have been thinking about the number, 147. I told you I had counted, and I had, and the number is not a boast, and it is not a horror story. It is simply a number. The number of people who died in my care over 9 years at Mercy Valley. The number of people whose last night, or last hour, was attended by my attention and my presence and my judgment. Of those, I can tell you with confidence that the overwhelming majority died as they would have died without my particular interventions. The timing, the threshold, the full authorized range rather than the conservative lower portion of it. The disease took them at the pace the disease intended, and what I provided was comfort and presence and accurate, careful management of what the disease was producing. Of those, there are some whose dying I affected in the ways I have described. Fewer than you might fear. More than I sometimes let myself acknowledge in the bright light of ordinary days. I have counted those too, but I will not give you that number, because that number is not the most important thing I have to tell you, and because I do not want the number to become the story, to collapse everything into an arithmetic that substitutes for the actual complexity. The actual complexity is this: I was paying attention. I was applying the best judgment I had in each specific moment, to each specific person, in each specific room. The judgment was trained and genuine, and, in the places where it was not pure, it was corrupted by things that I believe were human rather than malicious. The need to relieve suffering, the inability to be entirely neutral in the face of other people's pain, the particular occupational hazard of caring too much, or caring in a way that was not always distinguishable from certainty, from authority, from the belief that I knew what the room required. That is my confession. Not that I was a monster, not that I acted from cruelty or greed or carelessness, but that I acted from a self that was not as transparent to itself as it believed, that the line between attending to the patient and attending to my own idea of what the patient needed was a line I crossed without always knowing I was crossing it, and that the crossing was invisible in the documentation and visible only in the rooms at night, when no one was watching except the machines and the people who were dying. Episode 9. What I told Adaeze. I said earlier that Adaeze doesn't know who I am. That was not entirely accurate. I need to correct it. 3 years ago, before the diagnosis, I looked her up. I don't know why I did it then specifically, rather than at any of the years of points before or after. Perhaps it had something to do with the particular mood of a Saturday afternoon in late September, when the light was doing something to the quality of the air that made me feel the way I feel when I have unfinished business. I found her online without difficulty. She had kept the family name. She lived in Baltimore, worked for a community development organization, had a daughter of her own, 9 years old at the time of the photograph I found. I wrote her a letter. I want to be precise about what the letter contained and did not contain. It did not contain a confession. It did not explain who I was in clinical terms. It was a letter from a nurse who had worked at Mercy Valley during her mother's admission, who had wanted to reach out because she had thought of her mother often in the years since, because Margaret Osei had been a person of unusual intelligence and grace, and had made an impression on me that was not ordinary, that had stayed. I told her that her mother had talked about her constantly, that she had spoken about Adaeze's work with a pride that was not the ordinary parental pride, but something more specific, a pride in the particular person her daughter had turned out to be, which Margaret distinguished from pride in the person she had hoped her daughter would be. And she said that in her experience, these two things were rarely the same, that parents hope for children who will reflect something back, and get instead children who become themselves, and that getting a Daz, who had become so entirely herself, was the best surprise of her life. I told her that her mother, on the last night of her life, was not afraid. I told her that the room had been still and warm, and that she had been, at the end, somewhere close to peaceful. That was not entirely the truth. It was not entirely a lie. It was the version of the truth that I believed Margaret would have wanted her daughter to have, which is, I recognize this, another example of the thing I have been confessing. Another instance of deciding, on someone else's behalf, what version of the truth was the right one. Adaize wrote back. Her letter was brief and gracious. She thanked me. She said she had not known the details of that last night because she had not been there, because she had driven home at midnight thinking her mother had more time, and she had gotten the phone call at 5:30 in the morning, and not knowing what the room had been like in the interval had been one of the things she'd carried. She said, "Thank you for telling me she wasn't afraid. I've needed to hear that for a long time. I have her letter. It is in the drawer beside this bed. I have read it many times. I read it in the way that you read things that are both comfort and indictment, that give you something and take something at the same time, that exist in the particular overlap of gift and cost, that is available only when you have done something complex in the world and can no longer pretend it was simple." I told her the truth about what her mother said to me, the thing about the distance between the fact and the reason for the fact, the thing about living in the distance. That was real. I gave her that real thing. The rest, whether the night required what I believe it required, whether Margaret's death at 4:47 was the death the room was moving toward regardless, or whether it was a door I opened that would have taken longer to open without my hand, that is the thing I did not tell her, will not tell her, the thing that is not hers to carry. It is mine. Episode 10. Dosage. I am tired now. The good kind of tired, not the fearful kind, not the fighting kind, the kind that means the body has done its honest day's work and is willing to rest. David came this afternoon and adjusted the medication, and it is doing what it's supposed to do. And I am here, present, in my living room, with the oxygen concentrator and the modified bed and the window facing east. And in a few hours, the sky will begin to lighten, and I will watch it the way I have watched thousands of mornings from the wrong side of the night, from the side where the night's work is done, and the day is coming with its ordinary light and its ordinary demands. I have never been afraid of dying. I want to say that, and have it be fully true. And it is fully true for me in the clinical sense. I know the process. I know the stages. I have watched it enough times to have had the mystery replaced by a kind of technical familiarity that is not beautiful, but is in its own way a form of peace. The mystery I did not expect is the one I am sitting with now, which is not the mystery of death, but the mystery of the life that produced this particular death. What I have been telling you is not a story with a clean ending. You probably already knew that this channel does not offer clean endings, that what it offers is the thing instead of the story we tell about the thing, the actual material of a life rather than its arranged presentation. I have tried to give you the actual material. The actual material is this. I cared about my patients. I cared in a way that was not manageable, not clinically appropriate in its intensity, and not the bounded professional warmth that training recommends. I cared with the kind of care that looks exactly like competence from the outside and feels, from the inside, like something that has no official name in the professional literature, something that combines attention and authority. and a need to be the person who knows what the moment requires and acts on that knowledge. Whether that care was good, whether what it produced in the rooms was better than what would have been produced without it, I genuinely do not know. I have tried to know, and I have failed to arrive at certainty, which is, I think, the appropriate conclusion, the only honest one available to me. I know that Margaret Osei died without fear, and that Adazi has that to hold. I know that Robert Cahill said Patricia's name at the end, and that the saying of it was the thing he'd been waiting to say, and that he said it. I know that Gerald Okafor kept time to the last, and that that is the most honest thing I can tell you about who he was. I know that Dennis Marsh died on a day shift when I was not there, and that I do not know what his last night was like, and that I think about this. I know that my mother died in the way she had said she wanted to die, at home, in her own house, looking at her own ceiling, and that I was with her in the leaving silence, and that I did nothing except be her daughter, and that I do not know, even now, whether the doing nothing was the most or the least I have ever done. I know that Annette Mbeki is out there somewhere, on an evening shift, in a different hospital, in a different city, going into rooms and paying attention with the quality of attention that comes from a settled place, a place of peace, and that she is doing it without the particular shadow that accompanied my version of the same work, and that I am glad of this, even as I am uncertain whether her version produces the same. What would the word be? Relief. Whether her version produces the same relief in the rooms. I know that David will come tomorrow and adjust the medication and check the concentrator, and sit in the chair by the window if I seem to want company, and leave if I seem to need solitude, because he is paying the right kind of attention, the kind that serves the patient rather than the need to serve. And I find this, at the end, both comforting and quietly, unexpectedly moving. What I do not know, the thing I am leaving with you, the thing I cannot resolve and do not expect to, is whether I was the person I believed I was, not whether I was good or evil. Those are categories I have never found useful, and I am not going to begin now. Whether I was the person I described to myself, in the rooms, in the dark, in the specific seconds between assessing what was needed and acting on the assessment. Whether the version of my judgment I had narrated to myself for 9 years, careful, accurate, patient-centered, principled, operating always in the service of the suffering person in the bed, was the version that was actually operating, or whether it was a story I told so well that I had forgotten it was a story. I have spent 9 months with this question, and I am not going to answer it in the next few hours. What I know is what Harlan knew, what Annette saw, what my mother named when she looked at me across the kitchen table in the 8 months she was in my care. That certainty, in a person who is good at their job and knows it, is the most dangerous instrument in the room. That the distance between confidence and arrogance is not always visible even to the person living in it. That the best thing I ever brought to a room was the attention, and that the attention was, at its best, clean and specific, and genuinely directed outward, toward the person in the bed. And that at its worst, it turned back on itself and became a mirror, reflecting my own certainty back at me in the shape of a justification. I have told you the truth, all of it that I have. There is one more thing. I said earlier that I had counted the ones I was certain about and the ones I was not, and that I would not give you the second number. I'm going to keep that. Not because it matters legally. Nothing I have told you is evidence. Everything I have told you is the interior account of a private psychology, and I am dead or nearly dead. And the documentation is correct and complete, and nothing will follow from this. I'm keeping it because the number would substitute for the understanding. Because what I need you to hold is not a number, but a question. What is a nurse? What is any person given authority over the most intimate passage of another person's life? What do we owe to each other in the rooms where everything that is peripheral has been removed, and what remains is only the irreducible fact of a body and a consciousness and the time between now and its ending? I do not know the answer. I know what I did. I know that I did it in the genuine belief that it was the right thing. I know that the genuine belief was not sufficient protection against the possibility of being wrong. I know that being wrong, in the rooms I worked, had consequences that were final and without appeal. And I know that every nurse who has ever worked a night shift in a room where someone is leaving has had some version of this standing in front of them, some version of this specific distance between the authorized and the possible, the documented and the actual, the certain and the true. Not every nurse walks up to the line. I walked up to the line many times. Some of those times, I believe I stopped. I want to tell you that I believe I always stopped. I want the last thing I say to be the thing that resolves it. That makes it possible for you to leave this story with a conclusion, a verdict, a placement of me in the appropriate category. Good person or bad person, nurse or something else, mercy or something that only resembled it. I'm not going to tell you that. What I'm going to tell you is that tomorrow morning, David will come and the sky will be doing something through the east window, and I will be here or I will not. And if I am not, the room will have had the quality it always has. That particular stillness, the leaving kind. And someone will have been in it, paying attention, making the calibrations the moment requires. I hope they are certain. I hope they are also in the place just below certainty, afraid. The afraid ones pay closer attention. I know this because I was, finally, in this room, being attended to, rather than attending, at the end of everything, afraid. And I have been paying closer attention than I ever have in my life. Whether that is enough, whether any of it, any of the 9 years, the certainty and the care and the threshold and the rooms, whether any of it was enough, I think you already know I'm not going to answer that. I think you've known for a while now. That's the thing about truth. You recognize it before you're ready for it. I chose the nights. I chose them all.